Hello and welcome to Voices of Reclamation, hosted by Baltej Sahura.
And Alex Shinavetsky.
Our episode titled today is called Beyond the Numbers, the Cost of Educational Inequity. Today is a special episode because, we'll be talking about an important topic with a special guest. Though she is not in attendance, Miss Atkinson submitted her written response to help us. Greer Atkinson is a regional educational coordinator from the Mino Binswaden educational body, an indigenous leader who supports First Nation education.
Now, before we start our podcast, we would like to give the land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that the city of Vaughan is situated in the territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We also recognize the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The city of Vaughan is currently home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people today. As representatives of the people of the city of Vaughan, we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and live in this territory.
Okay, so now to start off our podcast. Now, to kind of refer back, we have to refer back to our call to action number 9. Before that, what is the call to action? So, to the viewers, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was created through a legal settlement between residential school survivors and the Assembly of First Nations. So Inuit representatives and the parties responsible for creating and operating of the school was kind of a way to expose the truth about residential school system and its lasting impacts on Indigenous people. So in 2015, the Commission released the 94 calls to action to guide Canada towards truth, justice, and reconciliation. Now, basically, these calls to actions, they were not just suggestions, they were urgent recommendations for all levels of government. Now, the group are called into two broad categories. There's the legacy category, which addresses the harm caused by residential schools, and then there's the reconciliation, which is promoting equality and respecting moving forward. The call to action focus on areas as child welfare to ensure Indigenous children are cared for in their communities, education to teach all Canadians about Indigenous history, cultures, and the truth of residential schools. We also cover over land and culture to protect and revitalize Indigenous languages and traditions, and health to close the gap in health outcome between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. The TRC also called for a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, which is now a national holiday on September 30th. We also called for the implementation of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There's also an ongoing public education and awareness to combat ignorance and racism. And basically, these call to actions are kind of like blueprints for change, but they require action, not just words.
Now, our call to action is call to action number 9, which states that we call upon the federal government to prepare and publish annual reports comparing funding for the education of First Nations children on and off reserves, as well as educational and income attainments of Aboriginal peoples in Canada compared with non-Aboriginal people. Comparing education between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people is important because it shows gaps in access and achievement. This helps governments and schools create better programs to support Indigenous students. It also helps support reconciliation by addressing the effects of past discrimination and residential schools. This comparison promotes fairness, ensuring Indigenous students have equal opportunities to succeed. And lastly, it helps preserve Indigenous languages and culture in education.
Now, we created a big question to help us navigate through call to action number 9. Our big question regarding this call to action is, how can Canada address the educational funding disparities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students to ensure equal opportunities for academic success and the preservation of Indigenous cultures? Now, personally, I feel like one way Canada can start addressing the funding gap is by recognizing that equal funding isn't always fair funding. Indigenous communities, they often face different challenges, like remote locations, more lack of resources, or even like access to clean water. It was so important that they get those necessities. And it's not just about dollars either. It's about making sure that education supports indigenous identity, their language and their culture, and not just a standard curriculum. And honestly, right now, I don't think I have all the answers to answer this big question fully right now, but I know that respecting indigenous voices and letting communities lead the way is a big part of it. And I feel like by the end of our discussion, we'll see that funding is just one piece of the bigger picture, and one's about justice, healing, and equal opportunity for all students.
That's an interesting perspective, Baltej. For me personally, I think in order to fix the funding gap, Canada needs to give Indigenous schools more support in general. Like, not just the same as other schools, but what they actually need. A lot of these communities don't have the same resources, so it makes sense that they need more help to catch up and keep their culture strong. It's not just about the money though, it's also about making sure kids learn about their own history and languages, not just what's in regular textbooks. We'll also probably get a better idea once we go through the other questions and see how it all connects.
Yeah, I totally agree. And now, before we continue to our sub-question, we have our written response from Greer Atkinson, so I'll read it out loud. So, in quotes, to really address the funding disparities, Canada needs to understand that equal doesn't mean fair. Indigenous students deserve education systems that reflect who they are, where they come from, and what their community need. That means funding must go beyond their matching on what Indigenous, non-Indigenous schools get. It has to support language, land-based learning, and cultural programming, and local curriculum development. These things cost more, but they're essential. True equity means giving Indigenous students the tools to succeed academically and culturally. And the best way to do that is by putting resources directly into the hands of First Nation communities and trusting them to lead. Okay. And, if I could ask you a question on what we just, went over, what kind of stood out to you on what Greer said?
Yeah, something that really stood out to me was her saying that equal doesn't mean fair. That's really interesting to me because it means that just giving Indigenous communities and children the same education that the rest of Canada has, it doesn't help them because it doesn't help them in their real lives, and it doesn't help bring their own culture and languages back. Instead, it just helps conform them to Western society.
Yeah. Personally, what I think kind of stood out to me was how she kind of highlighted, similar to what you said, it's not all about the money. It's not just about the money. It's they actually need real tools, real resources. I want to connect kind of what she said back to a book that I was reading in school for one of our projects. This book is called The Absolute True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, and it was written by author Sherman Alexie. Now, in this book, I remember a certain chapter where our main character, who was an indigenous person named Junior, he was growing up on the reserve, and the story's kind of about him trying to leave the reserve so he can seek higher education. And kind of this chapter that I'm about to mention kind of pushed him to the edge to really do that. When he was on the reserve, he was the teacher was handing him textbooks, and that textbook was a 30-year-old textbook. He knew that because the textbook had his mom's initials written on it from when she was the same age as him. And personally, I just wanted to ask you, what would you do if you were given something to learn from, and it's this old, something even your parents learned from?
Honestly, I would be kind of concerned because the fact that it has my mom's own initials in it means that it's, as you said, pretty old, which means that it could be rather outdated. So the information in the textbook can no longer be correct. It can be outdated, leading to false information.
Yeah, and key point, outdated. I feel the tools that indigenous people on these reserves, especially in schools, I feel they're outdated, and they kind of do deserve the same type of curriculum as we do. All right, so should we continue on to the next question, or do you want to add?
Oh yeah, something I would like to add is that they're the information for about the history and culture of Indigenous communities is being spread and talked about not just through the education system. For example, a book that I read is a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, and it's written by an author called Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's an indigenous author. And the book is pretty cool to me because it talks about indigenous lifestyles and practices and how to incorporate them into your life for both indigenous and non-indigenous audiences, while also pushing away Western practices which are harmful to the environment, which allows for both Aboriginals and indigenous communities to better connect with each other and their own roots while helping to sustain the land they live on.
Yeah, I feel like, both of our books, they really are kind of connected. Like through trying to preserve culture and trying to understand culture, but also kind of like seek for education through whether, it's our culture is like, that culture is like encouraging it, or if Western society is kind of downgrading it. So, should we continue on to our sub-question?
Yeah, sure, yeah. Now, our first sub-question is, what are the main causes of educational funding disparities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students? Now, for me, I feel like the disparities in educational funding between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students is mainly rooted in a complex interplay of historical, political, and systemic factors. Understanding these disparities requires looking beyond just surface-level economic differences and confronting long-standing structural inequalities. Now, the first issue is the historical marginalization and colonization of indigenous communities. So one of the foundational causes of funding disparities lies in the legacy of colonization. Indigenous communities in many countries, including Canada, Australia, and the United States, were forcibly displaced, stripped of their land, and subjugated to assimilationist policies, such as residential or boarding schools. These policies not only disrupted traditional knowledge systems and languages, but they also established a foundation of mistrust and underinvestment in indigenous education systems. Today, the impact of these colonial practices persists in the form of underfunded schools, poor infrastructure, and limited access to culturally relevant curriculums. Now, the second main issue I feel like is the jurisdictional complexity and governmental neglect. So in many regions in Canada, funding for Indigenous education falls under different government jurisdictions than that of non-Indigenous schools. Like for example, in Canada, education for First Nation students on reserves is federally funded, whereas provincial governments fund education for most other students. This separation has led to chronic underfunding, as federal funding formulas often lag behind provincial standards. The resulting gap means Indigenous students frequently receive fewer resources, outdated materials, and inadequate support services. Now, the final issue I feel like is prevalent is socioeconomic inequality, as in many Indigenous communities, they often face higher rates of poverty, unemployment, and limited access to necessary services, such as medical care. These socioeconomic conditions affect educational outcomes and access. Schools in poor communities typically lack the same level of local funding, as many school systems rely heavily on property taxes, a model that inherently disadvantages the community with less wealth. This economic disparity compounds the challenges faced by Indigenous students and schools.
Yeah, and before I continue mine, I kind of like to go back to what you said, your first kind of connection on what are the main causes of educational funding disparities, and I really liked what you said about colonialism. I feel like that's kind of like the root of it all,
Yeah, I understand, because it's seen in a bunch of other countries as well, not just Canada. As I previously said, it's seen in Australia, US,
yes.
India.
Yeah, it's like,
and a bunch of other countries in Africa.
Yeah, their homes are it's like the way I kind of see it's like they don't seem integrated into our our society. Not in a disrespectful way, but we say that they have reserves. They live in certain parts. They have these certain treaties. And I guess it's because the mistreatment that they received early on.
Exactly, and the main thing about colonialism that most people don't understand is that it wasn't meant to help other countries. It was meant to strip them of all their resources, which left them dry and no way to grow their economy.
Yeah, of course. And now, I liked what you said. It was very interesting. And now, if I could add on. Also, I feel like, one of the main causes was systematic racism, which kind of connects to colonialism. Because, systematic racism kind of rooted from the fact that people colonized. And, systematic racism, it plays a critical role in like maintaining and perpetuating, funding disparities. Indigenous voices, they have been excluded from educational policy making, and that kind of resulted in policies that don't kind of reflect their needs or their priorities. I feel like the lack of indigenous representation in decision making bodies and educational leadership, often means that disparities go underaddressed or minimized. I also feel like there is also a lack of accountability. Even when these disparities were acknowledged, governments, they failed to act with urgency or even commitment needed to address them. I mean, take our call to action, for example. The call to action was released in 2015. We're here now 10 years later, and the call to action has not yet started.
Yeah,
How do you feel about that? If you were somebody indigenous,
like honestly, I'd be like, in all fair, like kind of pissed because I feel like I'm a second-hand citizen. Like I'm not like that main priority.
Yeah.
But like a thing I also really liked that what you said was that there is a lack of indigenous in policy making, which also goes back to your lack of accountability and political will. Because if there's a lack of indigenous representation in provincial leadership, then that means that there's like no viewpoint for anyone to want to like further perpetuate the creation of these policies. And since there's a lack of indigenous people in the said parties, that means that there's no accountability because they themselves aren't indigenous.
Yeah, I totally agree. And to kind of conclude, what we said, I feel like educational funding disparities, between indigenous and non-indigenous students, it's not an accident. It's not. It's on purpose. Whether it's not the current government who decided this, but most definitely the people who kind of colonized this country. They're kind of a product of historical injustice, systematic exclusion, and like political neglect. And I feel like closing these gaps, it kind of requires more than just equalizing budgets. It demands a fundamental shift in how education system values and supports indigenous knowledge. Anatomy and rights. I feel like true equity will only be possible when indigenous communities are empowered to shape educational futures, which are backed by sustainable, adequate and culture appropriate funding. Now, would you like to kind of say what Greer Atkinson had as her response?
Now, for the indigenous perspective on this, Greer Atkinson had told us that since call to action number 9, we've seen some progress, especially with a shift towards regional education agreements, which give First Nations more control over their education systems. That's a move towards accountability because it puts the power back in the hands of communities. But real transparency means more than reporting numbers.
Yeah.
It means being honest about what's working and what's not, and staying in consistent, respectful partnerships with First Nations. There's momentum, yes, but accountability is ongoing. It's something we build every day through trust, action, and community leadership. Now, what do you honestly think stood out to what Greer had said in this?
Something that stood out to me is obviously, her main message. I'll go over that first. Is, they're consistent. She's seen some progress, but there's nothing groundbreaking that it's kind of like a hope as a future to seeing this call to action be completed. Another thing that kind of stood out to me was she said REAs, regional educational agreements. And she said it's something that gives First Nation people more control over their education systems. And I feel like that kind of does mean that, these schools that are not in our, area, they're kind of on their own reserve. They're privately funded by the government. They don't have school boards like we do. Now, just a little silly question, do you think, maybe our school could use something like REA?
Honestly, yes, because we are like already living on their land, right? So I feel like the most fair thing that we can do to return back like the favor is that we can help them out with regional agreements.
But I feel like, do you think our school would be able to, afford being like something directly from the government, or is it better to be kind of like a part of a school board where we have kind of like regional wide?
I feel like genuinely it would be better for a school board because our school doesn't have that much funding, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like being in a board effort would allow for like other better funded schools to help them out more.
So probably like I feel like these indigenous groups that we talk about that kind of focus on funding, especially where Great Atkins from, I feel like they should also not just slowly, I hope right now they kind of are just a movement or a group. They have a educational system, but not many schools. They have a couple and they're all privately funded. But I feel like they should slowly shift into like almost a school board.
Yeah, but the main issue I have with this is that no real change will happen until accountability starts being done.
Yeah.
Because the main issue is since there's no accountability being done, that means no one's taking responsibility for the harmful actions that have been done to indigenous communities. So as Guru Atkinson has said, as soon as someone starts taking accountability, that is a major step forward in order to help out indigenous schools.
What do you think is the first step to accountability? To account specifically the educational disparities. Obviously, we've had ministers who've apologized. They went on Parliament, on Parliament Live. They've apologized. That's kind of accountability. Though nothing has really happened after that, if I'm being honest. But like, let's just say if you were somebody from Parliament, how would you start off accountability?
Honestly, I would want like a parliament-wide acknowledgement of it, not just like a couple of people saying, oh yes, this is an issue, but not doing anything about it. I would want like a federal government acknowledgement of this issue and for them to give like a year-long plan or a couple year-long plan on how they are planning on addressing these issues. Because just them saying this is an issue doesn't help solve the issue, because they're just saying, yes, we know it exists. But them not doing anything is kind of like a spit in the face, because it's them just saying, we know it exists, but we're not going to do anything about it because there's more important things to do.
And, I agree with you. It really is, a cold, spit in the face. Like, we've seen, parliament members, we've seen them apologize, but like, have you seen any news from that point on? Have you seen any movements? Have you seen our prime ministers? Have you seen them, start a movement, start a program, try to move things on, have it bring attention, be a part of their main plan? Have you kind of seen?
That's another issue, is that it's not really popularized by the media, because the media like generally neglects these kind of things because to them it's not that profitable. But if they like started like posting these things on the news and like social media, it would better help start like snowballing this movement into a bigger thing and not just like something off to the side.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's like the media is also plays a big part. Now, moving into a sub question 2, we could kind of connect it to how we finished off. Government responsibility, accountability. Our sub question 2 is specifically, even though we're kind of like bashing on the federal government on they haven't taken full accountability, they've addressed it but they haven't done anything. Can we highlight what has the federal government kind of done to improve transparency and accountability in indigenous education since they released Call to Action 9? So what I've gathered here was after Call to Action 9 number 1 was released, which it kind of asked the government to eliminate the educational gap and be more transparent. They have been some actual steps taken. Now, one big change that was the introduction of, like we said, the REAs in the previous things. It did give indigenous communities, more control over their education systems. Like how schools are run, what's taught, and how success is measured. Indigenous communities and their own private, things, they kind of run their own thing. And it kind of shifts away from government making all decisions and more about self-governance, which is, a big deal in transparency. Now, another important step was in Budget 2021. Budget 2021 is the annual budget that's released by the federal government. And a statistic that was pulled was that the federal government actually committed $1.7 billion over the 5 years from 2021 and previously for on-reserve education. That's a big deal, right? I mean, this funding is it's meant to support everything from school operations and staff to language programs and curricular development. Now, these changes aren't perfect, and there's always still more work to be done. Even though we've seen a large amount of donation, we haven't seen change, right? And but they show a move towards more accountability and letting indigenous communities lead their own education.
Yeah, I like what you said, especially the part of like their $1.7 billion in funding.
Yeah, when I sorry if I
Oh, yeah, sure.
when I first read that, I was shocked. Like 1.7 billion. I don't want to be rude, right? But I thought that does seem like an awful amount. I personally felt like, why can't it work? And even though it's over the 5 years, I guess it could kind of stretch out.
Yeah, I also like it because it's generally a good step in the right direction, because they're also not using this money as like quote unquote blackmail, because they're still allowing for indigenous communities to self-government while still like providing them this money, like allowing them to do their own thing while stopping some funding.
But we gotta address the outcome. I
mean, true.
So it was the budget. They released it in 2021, saying that in the past 5 years they've already committed 1.7 billion. Now, 4 years later, almost 5 years, we're already halfway through 2025. I mean, what are the results?
Yeah, that's just concerning.
I mean, maybe we could also blame media. We don't really get to learn much about indigenous culture or see much about indigenous news. But I feel like there should have been like a step forward. And who do you think's to blame for that?
Honestly, I don't think there's just one person to blame. I feel like it's multiple people in multiple different areas. Like there's some people in the federal area of the government, some in the provincial. There might be even some people in the indigenous self-governance area who might be taking money for their own selfish gains. Yeah. So generally, you can't really pinpoint a blame onto one person, as it's generally like spread out.
Yeah. Like even if we look at 1.7 billion, you divide that by 5. That's roughly around 400 million a year, right? 400 million a year. I think so, right? Kind of.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And do you personally think that would be enough to cover, a countrywide First Nations kind of educational promise?
Generally, I don't think it's enough for a nationwide response, but I do think it's generally a step in the right direction, because they are actively showing that they're willing to fund and support them.
Yeah.
However, some other things that the government has done to support call to action number 9 is that they have started using regional education agreements, or as you have previously stated. But the thing is, I can add on, as these agreements let indigenous communities to make more of their own decisions when it comes to education, which helps a lot with transparency, since the people actually running the schools know what their communities need.
Yeah, I feel that's the most important thing. The people from the community, they know what their community needs.
Yeah. Also, as you have previously stated, with the $1.7 billion in funding, that money is not just for buildings, but for programs, teachers, and for keeping things running long term.
Yeah, that's kind of true, I guess.
Yeah, so while technically things aren't perfect, they are like at least trying to give indigenous communities more control and make education more fair and accountable.
But do you think they're trying their hardest? Do you think they're giving 100, or are they kind of just saying, oh, whatever, just take it?
Well, I feel like they aren't trying their hardest. They are definitely not just saying, oh, whatever. As $1.7 billion is generally a lot of money.
Yes.
So they are putting in some effort. I just feel like it's not enough.
Yeah. What do you think the federal government's currently main priorities are? Like how high ranked do you think First Nations, the call to action agreement is up there? How high?
Honestly, since it's a First Nations issue, it's generally a bit lower on the criteria, as generally Canada would generally prioritize it's bigger demographic of citizens, right?
Yeah.
And the current issue here is housing, the job market, things like that. But that's kind of being overshadowed by
and this is something that's been going on for the past 10 years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So counting the previous government. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'd like to, read Greer Atkin's response to this.
Yeah, go ahead.
So what she said was, community-led initiatives are essential, because they start from the inside, from lived experience, language, land, and legacy. Programs like the Anishinaabeg Educational Institute or land-based learning at the Dishina are doing what no outside system can, creating education that reflect who we are. These programs aren't just complements to government efforts. They are models on what real success looks like. When indigenous communities lead and what the government steps into a role of support instead of control, that's when real, lasting change happens. What kind of stood out to you, what she said? Is there anything you can connect
Yeah,
it to?
what I really liked about what she said is like in the beginning, she said community-led initiatives, which basically means that it's not just the government doing something, it's also
It's the community.
Yes, indigenous helping their own people.
Yeah.
So while the government is just giving them funding, they aren't directly helping with their curriculum. So what these community-led initiatives are doing is that they're taking some of the funding and helping to like kind of shape and mold the curriculum into like their own needs, like what they need exactly to do, like
Yeah.
to help preserve their culture and like how to live their life on reserves.
So she kind of broke it down. Obviously the government has been doing their part. They've provided the funding, though they could do more through media, and maybe even give more generous amounts of funding, just to kind of put indigenous people in their main priority. But do you feel like these communities, they're kind of succeeding?
I feel like honestly, generally, they aren't large enough to make like that large of an impact. However, they are putting in the effort, which was counts. So while they aren't like directly making a huge impact, they are helping to start to lead like other government like funded actions. Like for example, the government may see like, oh, these like initiatives are like helping boost indigenous communities. So like the government might start like adding more funding to more indigenous communities, not just 1.7 billion across 5 years. It might like start doing more, like for example, like 10 billion or like money like that. So while they aren't exactly making like a huge impact, they are creating long-lasting changes.
Yeah.
As they help create a better pathway for indigenous communities in the
Yeah,
future.
but to tie it all back, it's all about culture. It's about how they're gonna use it, and what can their culture do with this amount of money, and how can they kind of expand the educational progress in their community. Now I wanted to ask you this question. Have you ever seen cultural learning make a difference in our classrooms, in any of your classes?
Yeah, I feel like, for example, like classes that help you learn about your culture, like extracurricular activities, they really do help someone, like a person, just find their own identity. Because like a person who doesn't like know their cultural history, they might feel lost in life and they feel like they don't have like a place that they belong to. Like they just feel like they're just like floating along in life. But like when like a cultural like class or like activity like helps them understand who they are, it helps them not feel like so lost in life, allowing them to like have like a better, more clear structure of what they need to do and where they need to go in life.
Yeah, I agree. And personally, if I could answer that question also, we've also seen culture make a big difference in our classroom. Like we got to address, we go to Woodbridge College. Our school is very, very diverse. We have people of all ethnicities and different backgrounds and different cultures. And one of the ways we celebrate that is Culture Day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the thing I like about Culture Day is just like anyone can participate.
Anyone.
So it's not just like limited to people like certain programs, like people in Chisholm. It's not just like constrained to that. Like if you have a culture that you want to share, you can volunteer and share it. So like no matter like how popular you are or like how unknown you are, you can still go up there and just show people your culture, like, and spread it.
Yeah. Now specifically in our classrooms, I have seen effect, because of culture. I feel like because of our diverse cultures, we're able to learn about more topics in curriculums. What I like about our curriculum is it's flexible, especially English. We don't just stick to one thing. We're allowed to also not just learn about indigenous culture, even though we're in NB3 EU. We also focus on other types of cultures, right? Other communities, other countries, right? And I feel like that's what I really like about this course, and how it's so diverse and how we could connect it to many things and different learnings.
Yeah, I like how you said that because since we are mainly focusing on other cultures, it allows for people not just to like learn about their own cultures, but it also allows them to better understand other people's cultures. So while like someone may think like another person's culture is like weird or like just odd, like why would you ever practice that? Them learning it through media written or filmed from other cultures may allow them to change their viewpoint so they can better understand that.
Yeah, I do agree with you, and I feel like culture is it's an important part of the everyday learning classroom.
Exactly, and culture is what makes a person who they are. Because if a person doesn't have their culture, then they aren't directly like linked to any group.
Yeah, I mean, imagine you were cultureless. Like, imagine like, not to be disrespectful, but imagine like somebody didn't know their background. Like, if I could ask you this question, if you walk into a classroom, everybody's diverse, but like you don't know your background.
Yeah.
How would you feel?
Yeah, if you like, for example, if I was like in that situation, I'd feel like generally isolated, because like it's not even like about like, oh, there's no one in that classroom who shares my culture. It's more like about like I just can't even share my culture with anyone, so just like no baseline connection. Because like while like your cultures may not be connected, like for example, like if you're European and someone else is like from Asia, right?
Yeah.
Your cultures aren't like directly like connected, but you can still share them, allowing for that connection between like two people. But like if one person just like doesn't have their culture or just doesn't know it because it was wiped away from them due to like an ethnic cleansing of some sorts, that means that only one person can share their culture while another one can't contribute to the conversation, leading to that one person feeling isolated. So like they just feel like there's like no baseline connection there.
Yeah. Now, to kind of conclude on what, we said, roles and communities play a big part. These communities are important. They help us kind of connect, and they help us, expand, as a community in either learning or, other aspects in life. Now, to kind of connect that to our sub-question 3, what roles do community-driven initiatives and indigenous-led programs play in addressing educational disparities, and how can they complete government efforts? Now, to start off, I think community-driven initiatives and indigenous-led programs, they play a huge role in tackling educational gaps because they focus on what actually works for indigenous students. For example, the Deshinta Center for Research and Learning is a great example of this. They use land-based, indigenous-focused education model where students learn through traditional knowledge and hands-on experience on the land. I feel like this kind of learning builds a deeper connection to culture and community, which can really improve student success and motivation. Another great example is the Anishinaabeg Educational Institute. It's run by indigenous communities and offers programs designed to reflect local cultures, languages, and priorities. It gives communities the power to control their own education, which helps make learning more meaningful and relevant. And our guest speaker, or who gave our written response, Gary Atkinson, is actually from the Anishinaabeg Educational Institute. And I feel like programs like these, the two I mentioned, they don't just fill in the gaps. They complement, government efforts by creating education that actually led by the people, and it's meant to serve indigenous communities.
Yeah, I really like what you said there, especially about the Chitna Center for Research. As like you stated, right? It's like a program run by indigenous people to help other indigenous people understand who they are.
Yes.
So I feel like it's really good because if like there's a gap in their education system for like self-discovering like culture, then like the Chitna Center of Research and like other programs like it fill in that gap, allowing for like indigenous people, if they want to find out who they are, they can seek it.
Yeah, it's a great research center, and they're an amazing place that helps people kind of connect and add on. Now, Would you like to add on to what she said?
Yeah, I agree. And also, I feel like there are some other programs that give direct support to Indigenous students, especially a really cool program that I like, which is called Building Brighter Futures. Now, what Building Brighter Futures is that it's a scholarship and bursary program that helps cover things like tuition, books, and living expenses. Like, for example, if an Indigenous person wants to go to college but they can't afford it, right? Then Building Brighter Futures will like help fund them so that they can afford like their educational like search, like help them like pursue what they want to do. Now, it's run by Inspire, which is not part of the government, but it has made a big impact with thousands of students across Canada having used it to go to places like college or university, which allows for them to not only pursue higher education, but allows them to come back to their Indigenous communities and help them to like build them up and like build them stronger, because there's like they have better education, allowing them to support their own education and other programs. Now, what's great about programs like this is that they will also fill in gaps where government supports might fall short. Like, for example, if the government doesn't support like that much, then like they Building Brighter Futures and other programs like it can come in and like fill in that gap as well. So not every student has the same starting point. And this kind of financial help can be the reason that someone stays in school or even gets a chance to attend it in the first place. Like, for example, if Building Brighter Futures or like other programs like it didn't exist, then that means like a person who couldn't go to school, they might turn to a life of crime or like a life of substance abuse because they never got like the correct like education that they needed.
Yeah, I feel like Building Brighter Futures is a great program. And I kind of feel like that represents what our podcast is trying to highlight. A community-driven initiative made by Indigenous people who have been given the profit, either by the government or publicly or privately, to help Indigenous education. And I feel like what Building Brighter Futures is doing by providing scholarships is just amazing. I feel like, imagine you were somebody, an Indigenous student, on the reserve who didn't have that much access to anything. It would be amazing if you worked your way, even in on a school reserve where education is kind of limited and hasn't been taken care of properly. Like we said, old textbooks, old education, not a new curriculum. If you were able to learn through that and also receive a scholarship to do bigger things in life, imagine how life-changing that would be, moving off the reserve.
Exactly, and I like that you asked this question in the first place because it also connects to our second sub-question, as even though the government plays a role, right? These community and non-profit efforts really help carry the government's weight. And when they all work together, the government and the community efforts, it helps create better chances for Indigenous students to succeed.
Yeah. Now, would you like to read out Greer Atkins' written response?
Absolutely, I would love to. So her response to this was that call to action number 9 is still important because the education gap hasn't closed, not in access, not in outcomes, and not in the respect for Indigenous knowledge systems. But what gives me the most hope are projects like yours, youth using your voices to push this conversation forward. Reconciliation is more than policy, it's relationship and it's action. When young people speak truth, ask hard questions, and amplify Indigenous voices, you are doing the work that moves reconciliation from a word to a practice. Keep going, this matters.
Wow, that's very nice for her to say about it.
Exactly, yeah.
And would you like to kind of connect back to what she said specifically about it's important for the youth to use their voice?
Exactly. The thing is, the youth is the future, especially of a nation. So if the youth starts pushing forward these ideologies and ideas, it helps for them to be pushed forward to other younger people. Because while the government does these speeches, it only reaches other people in government places or people of older ages. So the youth discussing this helps to push it forward to younger people, for in their 20s or 30s, because it allows it to be voiced to their own communities.
Yeah, I have a question for you. Have you ever experienced or noticed, educational inequality in our school or at least in our community setting here in Vaughan?
In Vaughan, I generally feel like I haven't really noticed that much inequality, but I feel like the main reason I haven't noticed it It's either because like I'm like too privileged to notice because like like me and you're right, like Vaughn is like very privileged area. Like we have like a lot of like things to work with here in terms of education.
Yeah.
But like also because like there's not that many like indigenous like people in Vaughn, which means that like you don't like get to see like their education inequalities like that much.
Yeah, and I think in terms of education, we really didn't have it that bad. I mean, we're growing up in Vaughan. I feel like, being part of the YRDSB, our school board, it's a good school board that, fund enough, and we get, the proper education in, well around the community. And I feel like that's kind of like showing us that, we haven't really faced inequality in our school or community, which, we're obviously grateful for.
Yeah, even if like we had, we probably wouldn't have like experienced it like that like much or like to like that level like that indigenous people have.
Yeah, true. Yeah, I understand what you're trying to say. Another question I have for you is, what role do you think, we as young people, can play in reconciliation? And I don't just mean like symbolic, like what can you like go out there and do right now to really push this message of reconciliation? I know obviously, we're here on this podcast, but if there's something else, you think we could do?
Yeah, so I think the main thing that we can do as the youth is to help spread this message to like other people our age, because that's like while like younger people they don't have like that much like leverage in terms of like policies or government decisions or like funding, they do have like one thing which the government doesn't have, which is a connection to younger people. Because generally a lot of younger people especially feel like a sort of like disconnect from the government, because like they are like around their age, they're a lot older.
Yeah.
Some of the choices they make are like a little bit questionable. So like
definitely.
as the youth, right, like if you like decide to like spread this like message to other people your age, there's like that baseline connection there, because like like this person's my age, like I might be like worth like listening to like what they're saying.
Yeah, I understand. I could kind of understand what you said. Like it is true. I feel like I'm not being biased towards any government, but I feel like in the past couple of years, whether it's a new government or previous government, there hasn't been that much of a connection to the youth's voice. They haven't reached out to the youth. They haven't kind of listened to our opinions, even though we are the future. We kind of connect to what could happen in the future, and we're kind of responsible for that. And I just hate to see how that's being thrown on to us, even though maybe these officials don't really think about listening to our voices in the first place.
Exactly, and that disconnect is the main issue here, because since there's like such a massive disconnect, like such a big gap between the government and like younger people.
Yeah.
Even if they like started like motivating, like trying to motivate younger people to like help indigenous peoples, it might not like work because they just don't trust the government.
Yeah, that's just the main problem, and what I love about our podcast, because reconciliation is what we're really aiming for.
Yeah, now a question I have for you is, have you ever felt nervous about speaking up on issues like this? Like, what pushed you to do like this podcast anyway?
Well, I feel like, to answer the first part of that question, we've really never felt, I don't think I felt nervous to speak up on any issue. I feel like I'm protected. My voice is I feel like I could perfectly use my will of free speech. I don't fear anything. I don't think there's nobody stopping me on speaking up in this issue. And the reason why we decided to do this issue is because we're both students. We're both students who are privileged, who are part of a school board, and understanding the call to action, especially call to action number 9, understanding that, there's people perhaps our age, at this very exact moment, are sitting in an underfunded building that isn't getting the proper requirements for education, the proper teachers, the proper necessities, or, any sort of modern technology. And yet, society is expecting them to perhaps be on the same level of education or do better things or the same things as people like us, even though they're not even being given, the right amount of effort, And I feel like, imagine it was opposite. Imagine we were in that situation and we were asked to, one day make it out of, the quote unquote reserve and make it to the big city, make it to these giant, economies. How would you feel if you just expected to do that with, very little?
Like, honestly, like, I just feel like kind of helpless. And honestly, I also really like about what you said about like you wouldn't feel nervous because of like your privilege, right?
Yeah.
That may not be true for example, like indigenous people or like people in similar situations. Because while it's easy for a person like outside their community to like not feel nervous about speaking up about these issues, for a person inside the community, it might be like more like of like a daunting task because like it's been like a thing for so long now, and speaking up about it might like not only give you like negative like viewpoints from outside but also inside your own community because people just got used to it.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I feel like it's important for us to once again really connect with the youth. Whether you're government or whether you're a part of an outside organization, it's important to come together and kind of focus on these types of issues, especially revolving our country and our people in our country, especially First Nations, people who were here on this land first, and just to see the way they're being treated by us, especially youths our age, to see the way they're being treated without receiving proper care. They're kind of pushed onto the side of having like their own world. It's kind of disturbing.
Yeah. So can I safely assume, to answer the second part of that question, that your main motive to like help co-found this podcast was to like kind of give a voice to those who aren't being heard?
Yeah, I think you perfectly summed it up.
Yeah.
I mean, once again, we're privileged. But when we kind of started doing our research on call to action,
exactly, and that privilege, it allows us to like spread like the opinions and voices of like other like people.
And I'm glad we're using it to spread the right message.
Yeah, like for example, like Guru Atkinson's like opinions, they might have not been heard because like she's an indigenous woman and like her opinions just might have not have been voiced because she's indigenous, because she doesn't appeal to like a broad audience.
Yes, I do believe that's true.
So I feel like this podcast like it helps like spread the awareness and like the viewpoints of like other indigenous people and their communities.
Yeah, I believe with you. And connecting back to what Greer Atkinson said, we're the voice. And I could kind of connect that to text to world connections, where there's also across the world, it's not just us who need a voice. It's around the globe. I mean, take Australia for example. Global indigenous movements are happening around the world. Indigenous communities and in places like Australia, New Zealand, and also our neighboring country, the United States. They're pushing for probably the same thing: education reform, land rights, and preserving and reinforming culture. Though it might not be the same as the call to action, we're not going to assume they're not trying as hard as us, obviously. But I feel like the overall message that the indigenous community, not just here in Canada but around the world, what they're trying to say is, we're here to stay. This was our land to begin with, and we don't want to kick you out, but obviously let us preserve our culture. Let us have our rights to education, and let our people prosper. If I was in their situation, what I just said is exactly what I would feel if I was in their shoes.
Yeah, exactly. And I also like how you like mentioned like other countries like Australia, New Zealand, and like the US, right? Because it shows that it's not only like Canada trying to like right their wrongs for what they've done to indigenous people. It's more like a global effort, right?
Yeah.
Which like also like connects like a different topic of like the UN's Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People.
Yeah.
Because basically what that states is that like this is a global framework that calls for indigenous control over education and for respect for their traditional practices and the knowledge systems.
Yeah, and that just shows that it's not just Canada, it's the entire world.
Yeah, exactly. And it helps that like the United Nations are spreading this information because it shows it's a global acknowledgement, not just like a select few countries.
And it's probably, connecting back to the youth topic, it's probably not just, other adults, or it's probably most likely not politicians across the world who are, in the US or in Australia or New Zealand, who are kind of pushing for indigenous, reformation and, education or culture preservation. It's probably also, well, at least I hope, youth like us,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
other communities around the world.
Because generally the youth are the future. So if the youth are like starting to like create like movements for this, and like eventually it'll like grow bigger and bigger.
Most definitely. And I, before we, continue to our conclusion, I feel like we should also highlight, the effects of what has come from, not giving a voice.
Yeah, exactly.
And I feel like one of that is the murdered and missing Indigenous women. Now, specifically, a movement for this was created for, justice in Canada and the U.S. It kind of amplified, Indigenous voices to, tie directly into conversations about, who is heard and who is seen and who is protected. Like, I feel like this is just one of the many. Obviously, there's also residential schools, right? And there's, throughout history, the youth not using its voice, or, being silenced by the government. It's kind of led to all these traumatic, events in history, which are, kind of sad to see.
Yeah, and I also like how you brought up the murdering and missing and disappearance of Indigenous women, right? Because to like build upon what you talked about there, this term like specifically refers to the high numbers of Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people who have gone missing or like murdered, right? Especially across the United States and Canada. This number is actually quite staggering, as in the US, Native women have faced murder rates as up to 10 times higher than the national average, which is actually kind of crazy to think about.
Yeah, it actually
because
is.
It's like a minor group of people, and it's even smaller because it's just the women, and it's 10 times higher than the national average of just people dying. That's kind of crazy to think about. And in Canada, although Indigenous like women, they make up 4% of the population, they actually account for over 16% of all female homicides, which is also really concerning. What is even more alarming though is how many of these cases have gone unsolved, or like even worse, unreported. So just like think about that. In your community, the women in your community are getting murdered like 10 times higher than the average murder rate, and they're either going unsolved or like just they're not even being reported. Like, imagine that. Just like, What are your thoughts on that?
It's, well, I'm left in shock because once you highlight it 10 times, it's kind of very disturbing to think about, and it's kind of sad to see. And I feel like that could kind of connect back to our call to action, not directly, but obviously through the fact that there needs to be a voice.
Exactly, yeah.
I feel like all of our call to action is, to summarize, the whole point is somebody needs to speak up. Somebody needs to give their voice. And then, alongside us, somebody needs to make a change.
Yeah. But like, the thing is, there are like many reasons for this crisis, but like the issue is like none of them are like justified. So the first reason is primarily systemic racism, as both in law enforcement, so like police departments, things like that, and the justice system, there is often cases that are like mostly ignored or mishandled for Indigenous women. So clearly there is an issue there. There's like racism there, as they're like viewing their cases as less important. They're ignoring them. There are also gaps in the jurisdictional system, as between the tribal, federal, and local authorities, it makes it harder to investigate or prosecute any crimes. So basically, just what that means is, right, is that between the like tribal law enforcement and jurisdictional systems in Indigenous communities and outside of it, there's a clear disconnect, so they can't work together as smoothly. This leads straight to many Indigenous families left without answers. So just imagine that, like, your daughter or like
Yeah.
your wife or your sister,
Yeah.
she got murdered, but like there's no answer or like
And
who did it.
this is also another call to action, I believe. It's a part of the reports for, the murder of missing children, and it's kind of sad to see, there hasn't been any action about specifically this, or at least not as much. And I feel like that's another important issue I think we should quickly chat about right now. That many of the call to actions, they're uncompleted. The ones that I feel like the past 10 years the government has really focused on were the water reserves. What are your thoughts on that?
So my thoughts on this is just honestly, while it's a really major issue, I feel like they aren't doing as much as they can, honestly.
Yeah.
Like, both in terms of solving that issue and working on multiple issues. Because going back to what you said about most of the call to actions not being completed, it wouldn't be that big of an issue if the call to actions were like being like processed right now. Like they're actively working on them. They're just like not finished yet. But the issue is a lot of them haven't even been started yet.
Especially R1, which is
Exactly.
disappointing. Education's a very important thing in this country, and the fact that are the people who came here first, the First Nations people, the fact that indigenous people's rights for education are not being respected, they're being downgraded, and we're not even being given the reports that we're begging for, to see the difference in how much pay goes into our education compared to theirs. It's kind of sad to see, because that's all we wanted to see, a visual report of how much money is being spent.
Exactly, and this like correlates very closely to the murdering and disappearance of indigenous women. As in both of those, the calls for justice are like often very unheard and mostly just ignored. So human trafficking is also part of like intergenerational trauma from colonization, as the ongoing effects of it affect and create poverty and marginalization, which contribute to the silent emergency, which also creates more gaps between the justice system and indigenous people. Yeah, and this creates a lot of families who carry trauma of their missing loved ones, often for generations. So just like imagine that again. Like I know, like I'm like kind of going back to a previous statement I just said, but like just imagine that like someone in your family, they got murdered by someone.
Yeah.
But like there was never like any like report or like any justice done, and it goes on for generations. So eventually it can like affect your mother or like your grandchildren.
I just think this eventually, kind of ties back to the government not taking action, which I think they should. But I feel like, our topic right now, we're talking about the missing and murdered indigenous women. I feel like that does have a big play, obviously, in our call to action, but, specifically revolving around schools. When we think of schools and we think of indigenous, before we think of, modern day reserve schools, we obviously think about, residential school history. And I feel like the effect of that and the consequences of that, have a big part to play. Going back, I remember, we were saying that maybe, these indigenous reserve schools, they should be a part of a school board. They should be controlled by or managed by, the modern government and, what we have. But thinking back, that is kind of how residential schools started off. And
even if they try to like make a better system out of it, a lot of indigenous people might not be like okay with the idea.
Yeah, and I feel
because again, it's like similar to like the death of like the women. It like creates generational trauma. So like a lot of like family members who have gone through the residential schools, they might not just like let their kids go there because of like their past like experiences.
And because of that trauma, it kind of relates back to what Greer Atkinson said. That's why I don't think the youth, tries to push the conversation forward. Maybe, the modern day youth obviously is, because there's nothing to, fear now. But think about, our elders or, indigenous elders who had to, go through that. Imagine they were asked to, speak up against this. How were they treated? Some would, obviously would, but there's also, there's just this fear of trauma, because the punishment and the abuse that they were kind of given during that time. And I feel like this is why there hasn't been a lot of reconciliation revolving around reserves. I feel like the way the reserves are being run right now, the government should provide more money, and they should also, at the end of the day, our whole call to action is based off, they should show who is being funded more. Obviously, we should be funded equally. We should be given the same opportunities. If not, they should be given more, because because their land and how they're placed, and the reserves they're on, which are not in our area, not in our modern area. That's close to the border of the U.S. There's more access to other things, bigger cities, right? And because of that reconciliation, I feel like that's kind of put like this trust that's been broken, and they don't really want to kind of return back to that, at least not being managed in YDSBs or other TDSB schools.
Exactly, and I think I would like to add on that you kind of glossed over is that both residential schools and the murdering and disappearance of the women in their communities, right? Excuse me, is that they both have one very large thing in common, which is actually the loss of culture, because the death of an indigenous woman leads to the loss of their language, leadership, and future. So as we both know, right, the indigenous population is already pretty small after what happened during colonization. But imagine how much worse it gets when the women are murdered, because that leads to someone who may have had a tie to their culture dying, which means that they can no longer spread it to anyone else. Yeah, and I feel like this also ties directly back to residential schools, as these schools have also done a lot of false promises, such as to educate and civilize them. But in reality, all they did was they shoved the children go into the residential schools of their languages, cultures, and identities. So we can safely assume that this injustice and murder of indigenous women and children isn't a recent event. It's been going on for years now.
Yeah.
Almost a century.
Yeah.
And many of these children, they've also suffered emotional, physical, and even sexual abuse. Mm-hmm. Imagine that you sent your child to a quote unquote better place to educate them and fit them into society, and all they got was abuse, physically, emotionally, and sexually.
Yeah.
How would you feel about that?
Yeah, honestly, that's disturbing, right? And it's a horrible thing that that happened in history, and that kind of ties back to our call to action, because we're not though it's not the same as before, but we're kind of still neglecting them. We're kind of treating them horrible, and not providing the correct amount of education, which is just our big main question overall. And before we continue, I'd like to just highlight some institutions that are actually doing something to help call to action number 9, which so the first one is obviously where Great Actions is from, which is Indigenous-led Educational Institute, which is the Anishinaabe Educational Institute. They're located in First Nation-owned territory, and they control post-secondary schools and tuitions, and they offer programs and that kind of reflect community needs, culture, and heritage and identity. There's also 7 Generation Educational Institute, which is serving the Rainy Lake tribal area in Ontario, and this situation provides culture enriched education through secondary programs, degree programs, and pre-employment training. There's also a college I like to highlight, which is located in Thunder Bay, Negween College. And Negween College is basically partnered with Confederation College to offer diploma programs and certificate courses, tailored to Indigenous students. Now, based off all the schools that I named, we could basically tie back to the fact that there are people, at least hopefully youth, but obviously people in Indigenous communities who are now doing something about this education. They're offering diplomas. They're making sure people in the indigenous reserves, they're being given the rights to, like we are, to kind of like expand our knowledge. And, connecting that to what Greer Atkins said, the relationship and action, when the people speak, the youth speak, they ask us hard questions, but that kind of amplifies indigenous voices. And we're doing, the work that kind of moves reconciliation from a word from a word to, more of a practice. We're turning, or what other people are also doing, they're kind of, just from what, they're not just saying it, but we're actually doing it, which is something, I'm really proud of.
Yeah, and something I would really like to say before I share Career Atkinson's response to this is that the legacy of residential schools can kind of be seen like today in modern schooling systems that indigenous people go through. And not in terms of the physical and mental abuse they go through, but in terms of the education they receive, because sorry about that. A lot of the education that they receive now, it doesn't directly correlate to like what they need in real life, as we have like discussed before in the first and second sub questions. Like they are like receiving education, but it's not like applicable to their real life cases. Like you understand what I mean, right?
Yeah, I get it. And to connect that back.
Yeah, exactly. And to get like a better like indigenous perspective on this, we can go back to what Greer Atkinson has said, because basically she said that while there's still an educational gap, the youth and projects like this and projects like the ones you previously discussed help like shorten the gap between indigenous and non-indigenous people by helping creating better education systems for them.
And though there was trauma, like the missing and murdered women, right? And also, residential schools, the fact that, we're able to, the community's over to able to come this challenge and, eventually move forward and, kind of push their voices and not be in fear anymore. And, and that's being shown through, call to action number 9. It's amazing to see. And it gives hope that, this country is going in the correct direction and that hopefully, our call to action is eventually completed.
Exactly. Small steps like this are very key parts of making a big difference for an issue like this.
So, as we wrap up this episode, let's take a moment to look back at, everything we kind of explored. We started with our big question, how can Canada address the educational funding disparities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students to ensure equal opportunities for academic success and the preservation of Indigenous cultures? So Alex, after what we just had, how would you kind of like respond to that?
Okay, so after the discussion we had and after reading Career Atkinson's responses, which are especially helpful for insight, I feel like the main way the government can address this is not by just only publishing annual reports for like income between Indigenous and non-Indigenous education systems, because I feel like doing that, while it's a good step, it's not enough. I feel like what they could do is they could start by increasing funding and by supporting Indigenous-led groups. Like, for example, like the previous groups that you mentioned that like help Indigenous people learn. I feel like if they started like not only funding the education system there, but also funding those groups, it would be really beneficial for Indigenous communities.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And now the way I would answer that question is what I think has to be done to kind of address, our call to action, the way, the government could, kind of help us is, I think first of all, there needs to be a public addressing. I feel like they need to get on stage. They need to address, they need to take responsibility for not providing the correct education and not even giving us our annual report. Obviously an annual report needs to be shown, and obviously we're going to see that the fact that once that annual report is shown that we're probably being given more money, more to run our schools compared to people on indigenous land reserves. And once that's kind of shown, the government alongside with the people need to start creating more. I feel like more indigenous things should be taught in school. Topics like this, not just residential schools, but modern day topics of unclean water, unfair education, and missing and murdered indigenous women. And I feel like focusing all on this while making new organizations to help spread awareness will be a step-by-step process to getting closer to eventually completing our call to action.
Exactly.
Now, kind of to break everything down, we talked first about funding disparities between indigenous and non-indigenous students. I shared how true equity kind of means funding based on real needs, and not just treating everyone the same. Programs like what we mentioned before, the Deshana Center and the Anishinaabe Educational Institute. They're great examples of how community like education kind of reflect identity, culture, and connection to the land, which kind of all play a huge part in student success. We also discussed how the federal government has kind of responded to call to action number 9, including 1.7 billion from the 2021 budget and the introduction of regional educational agreements. And these all gave indigenous communities more control to their education system, a step forward, but obviously not the full solution, because it still needs to be properly addressed and our call to action needs to be completed. Now, and finally, we kind of explored how real progress comes from indigenous people lead. These programs, they aren't just add-ons. They're like the foundation of what education can and should look like for the indigenous youth.
Exactly. And hearing from Greer Atkinson also really brought that home, I feel like, because her opinions had helped us see that reconciliation isn't just about policy. It's also about trusting communities, centering indigenous knowledge, and funding education so that it reflects who students truly are. Yeah, and I also believe that this information also reminded us that lasting change also comes from when we put our resources into the hands of indigenous communities, not to just fix them, but to also uplift their strengths. Would you agree with that, Baltic?
Yeah, I would. And I feel like what you said, uplifting, and it's important part, not just handing the resources. Kind of needs to show that we're on their side and that we kind of support them, which is kind of what the government hasn't been doing.
Exactly, and us giving them the ability to make their own choices, I feel like really help them. So going back to our main big question, I think after what we've discussed, we can answer differently now. Not just our own opinions, but a common consensus. I feel as if that fair and culturally relevant education cannot just be achieved by the government alone. Honestly, I feel like as much effort as they put in, it's just not enough because of the damage done. I believe that this fix that we are looking for in order to help uplift the indigenous community, I feel like it will mainly happen when we share our power with them, by mainly supporting indigenous-led programs and by also really listening to what the communities have been saying all along. Would you agree with that, Baltash, or would you like to add anything onto that?
Well, I feel like going back to kind of what you said, it is important that fair and culturally relevant education, it can't just be achieved by the government alone. And I feel like obviously indigenous people and many groups like we named before, they're doing what they can and they're doing an amazing job at it. And I feel like also citizens like us, we're also doing our part and we should also do more after this, right? And I feel like, I also think though, I feel like we've done enough, especially indigenous people. Maybe we could do more alongside the government, but I feel like it's now, time for the government to truly take action, especially because they've kind of neglected the call to action.
Exactly. And before we finally conclude this episode, I would like to ask you, the audience, one big question, which is, what do you think we should do? Because while it is great that me, Alex, and here Baltage with me have came to a common consensus, you might have a different opinion for this. So if you feel as if we have missed anything, feel free to message us on our website. Now, I would like to give a big thank you to Greer Atkinson for being a part of this conversation. Though not directly, her responses have been greatly helpful to us. And to also thank her for working with us so that we can go day by day to support Indigenous excellence and education, as her responses have truly given us a really, really helpful blueprint on how to follow through with this decision that me and Baltic have come up with, and how to help Indigenous people in the future. And finally, I would like to thank you, the audience, for listening. So whether you are a student, a teacher, or just someone who got curious while scrolling on YouTube or Spotify about how we can move forward, I would like to personally appreciate you for being here and engaging with this topic, as you simply clicking onto this episode and listening for the entire duration creates another person who acknowledges the issue and may eventually go forward to help Indigenous communities in the future. So let's keep the conversation going. There's still a lot of work to do, but we all still have a role to play. Whether like, once again, you're just a student or a teacher, you can still help in the future.
Yeah.
And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening.
Yeah, and before we go, if there's any questions anybody would like to ask, go follow us on Instagram on voices_of_reclamation.
And if you have truly enjoyed this podcast, make sure to tune in next week.
Yeah, and thank you for listening.